Keto and crime, keto and crime. We uncover the grime on keto and crime. Keto and crime, keto and crime. Now is the time for keto and crime.
Hey everyone, Tracy here from Keto and Crime. Thank you so much to every single one of my patrons and channel members. You make this possible. And you're one of the reasons I do this. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if I haven't said it before, thank you. I'll sing it. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with me and letting me geek out, not making fun of me like a lot of other people do, because I like weird stuff about crime and dark history. Thanks, everyone. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Keto and Crime. Today, I've got the second video on Roman Catholic history, where we're going to go through the Dark Ages to the Renaissance. This is just going to be a brief overview of the time period and what the Catholic Church was up to during that period. It's also the period where you're going to see the Catholic Church take more of the form that we're used to today and probably wield its greatest amount of power during this time period. So, without further ado, and a huge shout out to my subscribers, my channel members, my patrons. Thank you so much for everything. Let's dive in. If you'll recall, when we last left off in our previous study of the roots of the Catholic Church through antiquity and through the Roman Empire, we left off with a study of Emperor Constantine, who was the first emperor of Rome that embraced Christianity as a state religion. Now, after him, you did have a period of brief peace, and then you had more combustion, for lack of a better word. Remember how he was like one of 8 emperors controlling Rome between the East and the West, because the empire had gotten so vast, it was hard to control from Rome. Well, that whole thing started to rise again, because Constantine kind of won a civil war, gave Jesus the credit for his victory, established Christianity, and then you had, monasteries, churches, church hierarchy formed based on the laws laid down at the Council of Nicaea. After Constantine's death, you saw his son, Constantine II, rise up, and then you had a series of emperors. But eventually, you had that old system of multiple emperors coming back, versus East versus West. And you had a capital reestablished at Rome, as well as Constantinople in the East. Now, by 500 Common Era or AD, you had the Western, what we know as Rome, classical Rome, Colosseum, all that good stuff, centurions, all that good stuff, virtually wiped out because of a huge amount of tribes. They had extended westward into Goth, into Britain, into Hispania, and you had a whole lot of what they called barbarian tribes that lived, had city-states and village-states in some of these conquered territories, starting to fight Rome. In addition, you also had the Huns, who were led by Attila, famously, and others that were really besieging Rome coming in. And a lot of these conquered people, known as the Goths, were just as afraid of the Huns as Rome was. And so you had a lot of them fleeing their native areas in what was today Germany and other areas, coming to Rome into the Western Empire for protection. So you had that happening. Think of it as mass illegal immigration. They weren't going through, what you had to do, I guess, to become a Roman citizen. They were just fleeing. And so you had that. And then you had some other Gothic tribes rising up, mainly the Visigoths, who basically sacked Rome a couple of times with help from people living on the inside, these Goths that were escaping the Huns. And you had Rome sacked a couple of times. And eventually, with the very last emperor of Rome in the West, a man by the name, well, actually a boy by the name of Romulus Augustus, he was in his very early teens, left there by his father, who was a general that had conquered Rome. There was a whole lot of still many civil wars. It was just a huge amount of strife. You could say that Rome was in a constant invasion of people as well as constant fighting. And so, infighting. And so you had a general that conquered Rome, took it over for himself, and then left his son, his young son, in charge. And then you had the last of the Goths attack him and basically conquer the empire. So when that happened, the West kind of collapsed into obscurity, and that's where you start having the foundations of the modern Western and Eastern European countries we know today take hold, when these countries that were once part of the Roman Empire in the West were now struggling to find their own way. So you had what we know as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, where they were all kind of forming their own. And a lot of these Goths and other tribes that had came into Rome had adopted Christianity as their religion. So you had early Christian church, now more formally known as the Catholic Church, kind of take shape and become kind of the leadership surrogate of this time, because you had all these warring factions, you had these little city-states, you had all of the stuff where there wasn't really a whole lot of law and order around, but you had the church, which was the most stable thing around. And this is where you started to see the Catholic Church become the state as well as the religion. And so this is how we entered into the Dark Ages. Now, what happened to the Eastern Roman Empire, the one headquartered at Constantinople in Turkey? It remained known as the Byzantine Empire for about another 1,000 years or so, until it eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and in Islam during the First Crusades. Now, we will get to the Crusades in a later video. We will also get to the Eastern Empire, or the Eastern Roman Catholic, or the Eastern Catholic Church as well, known as the Orthodox Church. That will be covered in a separate video toward the end of our series. So that is coming. And so now you have the West in kind of a dark time, even though a lot of the advances that we have today came from this period. A lot of the foundations of government, art, literature kind of came out of this era. It's still referred to as the Dark Ages because it was so splintered. Now, the church itself was forming as this major overarching power, and because so many of these former Roman states were used to, Roman Catholicism or Christianity being their state religion, that was allowed to happen. This is where you start seeing things like, the Anglo-Saxons in England still being Christians, and then they were later conquered by the Normans, who actually came out of France, also still Christian. Then you have what would be known as Germany and Spain, also made up of Christian tribes. I mean, there was a few little things in there like Druidism and other forms of pagan religion. For the most part, Christianity was the thing. And then you had basically the whole area around Rome on the Italian peninsula becoming Italy at one point. And that's where you finally have the establishment of Vatican City. In that area, and then the establishment of the Pope, which was formerly known as the Bishop of Rome. Now they have their own city with its own laws and its own, huge, almost castle or palace being established. And so now you have Rome kind of being the seat of power for the Catholic Church. And this will come in heavily into why things like the Borgias and the Medicis and all of the really solidified Catholic powers out of the Renaissance, and we're going to study the Borgias in fact, that will be my next video. You'll see how they almost became empires on their own, monarchy on their own. But it all wasn't bad with the Catholic Church. I mean, they did preserve art, literature, and Western history. Without the Catholic Church, Western civilization would not have survived the Dark Ages. They were one of the greatest patrons of the arts, literature. I mean, even though they had some twisted views, they were one of the greatest preservers of things like law, science, and as long as the science didn't conflict with their beliefs of the day. They were also very, very fearful of the growing religion of Islam that was growing out of the Middle East and threatening not only the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, but also now threatening Europe, because during the First Crusades, in which you saw the Ottomans, or the Ottoman Empire, which is a Middle Eastern empire, kind of conquer the Byzantine Empire and cause the Eastern Roman Empire to fall, you now had them threatening Europe. And this is where you had things like the Crusades, Vlad the Impaler, those kind of things rising out of a fear. This is also when Jerusalem started kind of switching hands a lot. And like I said, I'm going to do a series on the Crusades themselves, so I don't want to get too far into that. But you also had a lot of Roman popes, which were classically of Italian descent. The first of many Roman popes were actually Italian. It wasn't until the Renaissance that you started seeing other nationalities take pope, but they were very largely of Italian or quote-unquote Western Roman descent, really fear these things. And you started having the Roman Church, which really believed it was, the proprietor of everything, kind of ruling over monarchs. So many of the kings, like King Henry VIII and things like that, we're going to study in this series, really had to get permission from the Vatican to do a lot of things, because it was first church and state were seen as one entity. So you can see how the Catholic Church started to be almost a monarchy within a monarchy. And of course, this leads to a lot of corruption. What did they say? That power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is kind of what started to happen with the Catholic Church. It was in the 11th century, or about 1000 AD. This was about, we're about to enter the age of the First Crusade, that the College of Cardinals was established by the papacy to select the new pope. And the very first pope crowned by this new College of Cardinals was Pope Alexander II in 1061. Basically, the creator of that College of Cardinals, a cardinal known as Hildebrand of Slovenia, was basically the second pope. When Pope Alexander II died, it was the College of Cardinals that elected their founder to succeed him as Pope Gregory VII. So this is kind of evident of how, I don't like the term patriarchal, but it was. I mean, I don't like to use it in reference to myself or anything like that, but it was very patriarchal. Men were very much in control, and Italian men for the most part. So it's only ironic that you see kind of the politicking and the other stuff like that that would lead to the creator of the College of Cardinals being crowned the second pope. It was during this time that a lot of the most harsh laws came out, such as the selling of indulgences. Indulgences were actually things you could buy, holy relics, from the Catholic Church that would ensure that your relatives could get out of purgatory. Purgatory was also kind of a new invention that did not originally come out of the Council of Nicaea, but came more out of the College of Cardinals, where it's kind of a limbo between the two worlds, between living and dead. You're in this limbo while, I guess, God decides if you're going to come into heaven or go to hell. And basically, you could get your loved one out of out of hell, out of limbo, by buying indulgences. Of course, this was something that only the very rich could afford to do, but they were no less duped by the Catholic Church than the poor. Also, you had rules governing who could read what scripture. Basically, you had all the scripture still written in Latin, and Latin was something that, as it had kind of died with the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, you had only the very tip top, the 1% of the 1% that could actually read Latin. And so the only way for a common person like you or I to know what literature, what the scriptures actually said, was to have it read to us by our priest or a monk or somebody else that had studied Latin. So you had a lot of manipulation coming out of common churches as to what the average person was supposed to do. You also had the Crusades starting to happen during this period. And what does war require? Money. Who has the money? Kings, queens, monarchies. And so the Catholic Church would pressure the kings of various European countries that were just now in their infancy to basically either supply soldiers, supply men, supply supplies, or supply money to continue to try to take Jerusalem or keep the Muslims out of Europe. And so this is where taxation started to happen, where did monarchies get their money? From the common people. So they started to tax people heavily, and a lot of that went to the Catholic Church to fund wars that the Catholic Church was waging. By the 13th century, you had the founding of what would eventually become Catholic schools and universities. Under the Medicean orders, you had church-sponsored cathedral schools and palace schools, only for the upper crust at this time, being established. And these became reputable, in fact, the only schools of higher learning. And so you had that, this is where you had priests like Thomas Aquinas, Francis of Assisi, these people starting to establish the precedents that would eventually mold into the Catholic control of education, the church control of education. You also had with Spain, as there was also a lot of conflicts now between various monarchs and the Catholic Church. You know, the Catholic Church was getting a little too demanding, and some kings and queens didn't really appreciate that. But you did have a huge alliance between, basically the Catholic Church was in control of Italy, and then you also had a huge alliance between them and Spain. And so you had a young man by the name of Charlemagne, who was a monarch of Spain, basically calling himself now the Holy Roman Emperor. He was basically saying that it was the church's will that he rule Spain and help to control Italy as well. So that's where you have the term the Holy Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Empire starting, and this would play a huge political and strategic hold in future wars, as everybody wanted to be associated with the Holy Roman Empire. So because it was basically an alliance between Spain and Italy with the consent of the Pope, but who was really in charge there? You do the math. Conflicts between the state and the church continued into the 14th century, where you had basically rebellions between or wars between the Holy Roman Empire and other states over the overreach of the church. You had a lot of, and you also had the church basically looking to colonize other areas. By 1438, you had basically the Western Church trying to infiltrate the East and establishing, trying to kind of reunite with the Eastern Orthodox Church that was still prevalent there. By the Age of Exploration in the 15th century, you had worldwide exploration of the New World taking place. Everything from Spain, Britain, France were all in on this. and you had basically Catholic colonies being established, what is now the United States, Canada, the Philippines, and you kind of start seeing the Catholic Church really solidifying its control. However, 1400 to 1500, you also had a lot of upheaval and strife in the church. You had Martin Luther, who a monk in Germany, who basically nailed his, treatise to one of the churches there, saying, "I disagree with indulgences. I disagree with all of this stuff." And then this is where you start seeing the split between Catholicism and Protestantism. You also have basically the church trying to wage a war against the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, over the New World. You also start seeing King Henry VIII in the mid-1500s petition the Pope for an annulment of one of his marriages or a divorce, which the Pope would not grant. And then you see the formation of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, known as the Episcopal Church here in the United States. So that is where you kind of see the state religion in England flip to something entirely different, whereas Lutheranism took its, or the very first Protestant church under Martin Luther kind of take hold in Germany. So you start seeing the Catholic Church starting to decline just a little bit. All of this was fed by the rise of two families, the Medicis in Italy and the Borgias in Spain, who would run one of the most um, manipulative and corrupt papacies in history. And we will be studying them in their own little videos. So don't even worry about that. It's coming. As the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages move on, you have more and more states kind of severing their ties with the Catholic Church. You have kind of the fall of the Holy Roman Empire into just Spain and Italy. And then you kind of see a decline in the Catholic Church's power as things like the Spanish Inquisition, uh, the the Protestant Reformation, the English Reformation, and Counter Reformation under Bloody Mary Tudor, who will also get a video. You start seeing the Catholic Church kind of dip in its power in the later part of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. All of this coupled with the loss of Jerusalem, the fact that the Crusades were essentially kind of a failure, but not really. As I said, we'll cover that when we get there. But you had the people just kind of sick of that stuff. And so you also had more science, more philosophy. You had revolutions in the 17th century. You had the revolutions in France. You had kind of counter-revolutions in England. So you had a whole new generation of people taking control that didn't see the Catholic Church as the powerhouse that it saw itself as, and it had always been. And this is where we start to leave the Middle Ages into the Age of Enlightenment by the 17th century. And this is where you see revolutions, science, promoting that instead of everything rotating around the Earth along with the other planets rotated around the sun, everything contrary to what the Catholic Church had taught until this time. You see the ignorance of the Dark Ages kind of starting to splinter off and fall. And this is where we will enter what is known as the modern age. This is where, we go from early 17th century through the modern times and the modern Catholic Church and how it continues to survive today. And that's where we'll pick up in the third part of my history video with the Age of Enlightenment through modern times. And so I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back next time with a lengthy video on the Borgias, as well as one on Martin Luther and the Reformation, Henry VIII and Bloody Mary Tudor, and then we will leave the Middle Ages and go into the modern age. And with that being said, I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. And until next time, keep on crying.